So it's a real pleasure to welcome Martin Scherwath. He is a senior staff scientist with Ocean Networks Canada and SolidCarbon. I first met Martin maybe 10 years ago or more, 12 years ago, something, when he was getting going at Ocean Networks Canada. He's going to tell us about that, but really he's focusing on aspects of carbon collection and storage in the deep seafloor. Martin did his undergrad work in Germany at University of Hamburg. He went to Leeds to get an MSc in exploration geophysics, and then went to Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand, looking at lithospheric structure and deformation. He's done a lot of work also on hydrates. So yeah, he's got quite a background in different disciplines, which of course is exactly what's needed when doing work in the deep sea. And it's great to have you here, Martin. And I just want to hand this off to you, and we welcome your talk.
Thanks very much, Andy. Thanks for the kind introduction, and I hope you can all see the presentation now. So it looks good. Thanks for the
looks good.
Up. Okay, so and now I need to move the faces out of the way so I see the screen. But it's really nice for all of you to join. Thanks so much for coming to this presentation. And I'm going to be talking about both Ocean Networks Canada as well as the SolidCarbon project. So giving a brief introduction into the organization as well as the project. And the main title is A Future for Carbon Dioxide Removal Below the Deep Sea. And now I have to learn how to move the slides on. But before I start, I first would like to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanish peoples whose historical relationships with the land and the sea continue to this day. And I also like to emphasize that this group is marginalized through education, through the education system. So Indigenous people are totally underrepresented in science right now. And also the coastal communities are most impacted by ocean changes. We all know that the ocean is a complex system. Everything is interconnected, and a lot of questions going right into the details. Most of them can be answered with finding out through data what's actually happening. And that's not only in the ocean itself and anything ocean process related, including methane emissions from the seafloor, but also what's happening on the seafloor. And that's where COBRA plays a really, really important role. Like what's happening at depth. Everything is interconnected, we know that. And there is a mission on collecting data from the seafloor in a large scale. So that's how the Ocean Networks Canada in Canada, as well as the Ocean Observatories Initiative in the US, came to place by putting cabled observatories on the seafloor to allow really good continuing data acquisition of what is happening on the seafloor, in the seafloor, above the seafloor, at the ocean surface. And for Canada, it all started here, that little inset behind Vancouver Island in the Saanich Inlet here in 2006. The first data stream came online right next to Victoria Airport, and then extended over the years into the Strait of Georgia with a cabled observatory here coming off close to Vancouver Airport, actually, into the Strait of Georgia. And then was after that expanded by the Neptune Observatory in the Pacific Ocean, and also the Ocean Observatories Initiative's regional scale node or cabled array. It's got various names down the coast, which basically allowed us to have sensors all the way out into the spreading center of the Juan de Fuca Ridge, but various node locations where it's now possible to collect a lot of data. And we're not only doing that here on the West Coast, although that's our primary focus, but now over the years have grown around Canada, and there's a lot of collaboration and partnering going on. And in 2012, for example, we started an observatory at Cambridge Bay, a relatively small one, but it's in the Arctic, so it'll be under the ice in the winter. So we have an ice profiler there, for example, and also expanding onto the East Coast, not with these large cabled observatories, but more community-based, supporting ocean observations there, and hopefully more to come. And then just for those people interested, we also have now deep Argo biogeochemical Argo floats, and the first two have been deployed and are reporting successfully good data from the Northeast Pacific, and there are more to come. So we are expanding into that as well, although the data stream to where all the Argo data go. But talking more about how things are happening, the sciences that we are supporting, we have data coming from basically through for a lot of various scientific topics, and we can support quite a lot from deep sea ecology through marine natural hazards, earthquakes, tsunamis, soundscapes, quite amazing. And we are collecting a lot of data, so we are now also getting into big data and doing a lot of pairing with indigenous approaches and scientific methods. And by the way, this is a crawler called Wally that is also connected to the cabled observatory and can be driven from a pilot on shore. And if you watched Marjolaine Matobo's talk the other day here, the COBRA webinar series, this is one of the ephemer experiments connected to the Neptune Observatory Tempo Mini, looking at hydrothermal venting, which are always active, and we have instrumentation monitoring that 24/7. And we also, when we go and do the maintenance trip, record really amazing videos. Sometimes here's a seep site at Clackwood Slope, and this tanner crab is just floating up because it has bubbles turning into hydrate, which makes it buoyant. And it was just lifting off and coming back down. So there are amazing observations that we by chance making. As you can hear, we also have hydrophones recording the marine mammals out there. These are big orcas. And we also, unfortunately, measure ocean noise from vessels. So hopefully that wasn't too loud for you, but it basically shows you that with hydrophones, we can also get really high density time series and really interesting recordings from all the node locations. But what ultimately matters most is the long time series of observations that we can capture now. And this is, for example, from the Saanich Inlet, the longest time series we have, going back to the beginnings of 2006, where we measure here from a CTD with an oxygen sensor the parameters once every second, up with a few gaps, unfortunately, but yeah, up to now, and still going. And the initial years, as you can see in the temperature, looked a bit strange, where it looked like things are getting cooler. But for the Winter Olympics in Vancouver, there was a really warm winter without any snow. So it's just going up and down, natural variations. And even here in 2016, the arrival of a really warm surface water blob at the coast, making it all the way in. It was really warm. It was warmer that winter than it was in the summers, at least in the water before. Amazing time series, and all the data are coming into what we call Oceans 3.0, which is our data management and archiving system, and people can also access the data. And we're collecting data from over 9,000 sensors now, have over a petabyte of data that are freely accessible for science, society, and industry. And if you visit the portal, data.oceannetworks.ca, there are various tools that enable you to look at the data a bit more thoroughly, download them, exploring them, and you can always also reach out to us, and we can help you identify if there's anything in there that's necessary. In terms of our Ocean Networks Canada strategic plan, we have a vision and a mission and also various goals. And for the next part of the talk, I would like to focus now on the third goal here, which is to enable ocean-based solutions for climate change mitigation and resiliency. And there's one project that I'm going to focus on, which is the SolidCarbon project, but there are Ocean Networks Canada, through its amazing monitoring capability, can help a lot of other carbon sequestration or potential climate solutions through the monitoring, the observations, and help reporting and even verifying any kind of carbon removal. But yeah, let's go right into the SolidCarbon project. This is an offshore negative emission technologies for durable carbon storage in the ocean crust. And the current phase, which also brought the name SolidCarbon along, is currently funded by the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. But what I'm talking here, what I'm giving you an overview about is results from a lot of different institutions, and including the University of Victoria, where Ocean Networks Canada is hosted, as well as the University of British Columbia, University of Calgary, and a big partner is also the Columbia University with the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, as well as the Sabine Center for Climate Change and Law. So I'm going to show you a few and really key aspects of this SolidCarbon project. So first of all, going into the need, I think all of you are pretty aware that we are emitting too much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and even if we go and decarbonize the global economy, it seems like the goals that were set at the Paris Agreement to not have more global warming than 2 degrees, ideally only 1.5 degrees, are really hard or almost now impossible to get without doing so-called negative emissions, i.e. removing carbon again from the atmosphere. We are just not decarbonizing the economy fast enough, and we still need to focus and do every effort we can in achieving greenhouse gas emission reductions as fast as we can, but we also now need to look at really large-scale negative emission technologies. And so the idea of the SolidCarbon project is to use already existing technologies and combine them in a way to have CO2 stored in the ocean crust. So having sustainable energy generated, since we want to do it offshore, it's got to be on probably wind farms that are floating, doing direct air capture, but we're also looking into potential direct ocean capture. And then having the CO2 on a platform pumped into the deep ocean, where then over time, the CO2 in the basalt crust will react with the minerals to form a carbonate rock. So hopefully not being stored at CO2 for very long, and therefore not being accessible to escape and potentially even reach the atmosphere again. So doing that in the deep ocean adds a lot of safety measures. And this possibilities for this are global. There's a lot of fresh young ocean basalt with lots of readily available reactive minerals that can take the CO2 and turn it into carbonate rock. And the total storage capacity of all the reservoirs that are at safe spots and are very reactive is well over 100,000 gigatons. So the estimate going all the way up to 250,000 gigatons. So way more than hopefully necessary. Well, definitely way more than even if we pull out all the carbon and burn it all. And if we are that crazy, there will be enough storage for all that. But we're going to start this by looking focusedly on the west coast here of North America. And the reason why we're starting here is not only because we work here and we are excited, but we have the ability, if we're going to test this, to use the Ocean Networks Canada's monitoring capabilities and carry out an experiment with very good observations. And the Cascadia Basin alone, which reaches all the way from Northern California to Vancouver Island, can already host up to 750 gigatons of CO2, which at current emission rates is about 15 to 20 years of annual emissions. So that's what we think is the best location globally, but not only because we have the observatory there, but also if Andy Fisher would have an hour or half an hour here, he could tell you all about what we know about that location from previous drilling experiments. So this is a transect of drilling holes into the sedimented area on the east side of the Juan de Fuca spraying ridge. And these holes have been drilled over the decades, and the focus site here is at a site we call 1026 IODP or ODP and IODP efforts around that locations have been carried out, including an effort led by Andy Fisher. Thanks for hosting this again, and feel free to interrupt or answer more clarifying questions when it comes to that. That was carried out over the years, a tracer experiment to understand the fluid flow. Thanks, Andy, for making that happen. And so what Andy and his group and large group of collaborators did was injecting tracers in one of the new holes that were drilled in 2010, and then did fluid sampling in all the other holes around this transect to really understand how is the natural fluid flow in the crust under the sediments. And so this is work that's been carried out over the years, and good summary was published in 2016 by Nera et al. That show that these injected tracers move away from the injection hole in all directions, but over time seem to be flowing more towards the north at a higher rate during injection and then slowing down with natural fluid flow over the years. And so we actually know quite well what is going on in the subsurface. So if we would inject CO2, we now have, it's one of the, maybe the only one location or the location we know best about the natural fluid flow. So anyone who is doing modeling can have already extremely good results available. I'm going to talk more about that when I talk about SolidCarbon, but this is previous knowledge and basically establishing Cascadia Basin and particularly this site as the best location to look into carbon sequestration more closely. So our SolidCarbon project is split over various activity areas, and I'm going to mention two of them only briefly because I'm not an expert in this, and one of them is the engineering part that is looking into how we can generate energy and sustainable energy and actually capture the carbon either out of the air, and this is something that is being done already on land, but what they're looking is into how would it actually perform offshore. It's all currently is still in the form of a feasibility study, and only very few experiments can be carried out in very small scale in the labs here, but ultimately looking into how this can be ramped up to larger scales and looking into the various system designs and comparing central versus modular designs to basically enable the energy generation, the carbon capture, as well as then having that energy available to pump CO2 into the seafloor. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the activity area 2, which is basically trying to get to a demonstration where we are looking into what's happening at the subsurface. How does the CO2 when injected, and this is just, it's not going to be as bubbles, it's most likely be supercritical, but how would CO2 turn into carbonate rock? And we're also designing a monitoring system that ensures that if this is carried out, that it is done safely, and including making sure that we don't induce any seismicity here. So more details here. So we basically have, similar to the tracer experiment, injection well, and then injecting instead of just tracers that go with the flow CO2. And we already know from the tracer modeling that the sediments above the very porous and permeable ocean crust are essentially blocking off any fluid escape directly through the sediments. So we treating that sediment layer, which is at least 200 meters or 240, I think, at the current injection site, as a cap rock, and then see or model what will happen to the CO2 plume at depth, and have strategically a later monitoring plan with sensors to basically track this plume and ideally also detect the mineralization. And so this group in Calgary with Rachel Lauer and Ben Tudelo and their postdocs had been working on both actual rock lab analysis to see what's happening in terms of adding CO2 to the very young basalt rocks, or 3.5 million years old basalt rocks, as well as doing computer simulations of this reactive transport, and basically showing that if we scale this up, how will that happen? So first of all, most importantly, when you inject CO2, pure CO2 into the subsurface, it needs to dissolve. So it needs to merge with the existing fluids. Then the fluids also need to dissolve the minerals that are naturally in the basalt rock in order for the CO2 then to bind with the minerals and form carbonate rock. And how big will be the plume? How long would it take? And their ultimate latest conclusion is that if this is all ramped up to what we need to get to is a gigaton scale, that first of all, it is possible, and that mineralization is most likely, or most of it is happening within 25 years, which is really good news. We thought it might be longer, even much longer, but right now, at least the modeling shows that it's possible for it to happen in a much shorter time range. And then we also had, because this is a question asked a lot, what about if you inject something under pressure, triggering any earthquake? So we had a postdoc here, Inyanwan Ekpal-Johnson, looking at the existing faults and how would they react to additional pressures. And this is just a sketch from Sunedal showing that in the basalt crust, there are all these fractures and existing fault lines that have been mapped now as well. And so what would be the probability of any of them rupturing under what pressure? And then combining them with relatively high injection rates, up to 2.5 megatons a year. And everything is staying here in the green zone, which is good. That means it's less than 1% chance of any of these existing faults to actually rupture. And less so if we have a thicker aquifer, and we think it's at least 300 meters thick. So it's very, very extremely unlikely, or we said there's hardly a chance for any earthquakes, which is also very good news for us. And then what I'm primarily looking at is where to place what kinds of sensors. And we already have at the Neptune Observatory a suite of sensors, but for carbon sequestration, we need more specialized ones, including pH or PCO2 sensors. And we're also looking into controlled source electromagnetics, which can track the plume much better. And very, very important is also to keep monitoring what's happening in the subsurface with the fluids. So these existing balls that are still accessible, nicely left behind from all these experiments we had so far, and we can still reuse them and do more fluid sampling. And Beth Urquhart actually is planning to go there this summer to install more osmo samplers that can track these fluids. And we get an overview of what's happening now, a decade after the tracer injection, which is great. And then the final aspect in SolidCarbon is looked at by 3 teams, actually looking at the so-called acceptance. Activity area 3 is the acceptance group, and they're looking at the social acceptance. So what do people think about this? Like negative emissions in general, like how important are they, or specifically negative emission technologies? Do we need technical solutions? What are the acceptance for that? And also engaging First Nations and talking to various groups, finding out what is the general conceived idea of what we are planning to do. There's also a group led by Romani Webb at the Sabine Center at Columbia University for what is the current regulation, what are the international laws, what have we promised under the Paris Agreement, what are the London Convention and Protocol existing regulations for international waters, and to make sure that whatever we have in mind, most of it initially will be illegal at current state. So what are the laws necessary to be changed in what way in order to make this all legal? Because nowadays you can't just go out and dump anything in the ocean. That's not right. But in order for this to be a climate solution, it needs to become right. So there's a pathway. And then the final group is looking at so-called investor acceptance. What industries are already existing in that field? Can they support us? Are there companies that would like to have this move along faster than with public funding? So looking at private investors as well. And also what we're constantly looking at is how we go into the future with this. So this is my final slide now with the SolidCarbon timeline. So we've been working on this. I mentioned that in our breakout group early on. We've been working on this since 2017 under the Carbon Safe Cascadial program. And we so far have raised public funding in the order of $2.5 million. But we're still writing currently new proposals to all sorts of funding agencies in Canada as well as the US to get to this next stage, which is some kind of demonstration that this can actually happen in real life and not just in computer models. And so we are trying to bring down the cost by having alternative drilling options for even seafloor drilling, instead of having a drill ship on site, making it simpler and cheaper. And the earliest we could now think of kicking this off might be in 2025 with injection of a few thousand tons of CO2 by 2027. But really to scale this up, we need to get to megatons by, and we think when we can kick this off at this scale in 2027, over the next years, this can be scaled up to the megaton scale, which is required, and then having this technology available for a global rollout. So by mid-century, the SolidCarbon idea could be a gigaton scale solution. And with that, I thank you all for the attention. I hope I wasn't rushing too much through it. I hope I sparked a little bit of interest here and generated a few questions for you to ask. But yeah, thank you.